4:02 p.m., a sun-drenched villa overlooking Lake Como. The air is thick with expensive perfume and judgment. Elena Voss, the billionaire CEO, steps out of a sleek car. Beside her, a man in a simple suit. The guests whisper. They recognize him. He isn't a tycoon, he's just a single dad. Daniel Hart holds the hand of his daughter Sophie. His gaze is calm. His presence is quiet. The bride's family sneers. Is he staff? But as the ceremony begins, the groom steps out. He sees Daniel and stops dead. In front of hundreds of elite guests, he gasps, "Boss!" The entire chapel freezes. Daniel Hart was a man who lived in the shadows of his own greatness. At 40, he carried the kind of stillness that only comes from surviving a storm. 5 years ago, he was at the peak of the tech world, the oracle of Silicon Valley. Every major acquisition, every disruptive startup, and every visionary blueprint had his fingerprints on it. Then the storm hit. His wife, Sarah, fell ill with a rare, aggressive form of cancer. Within months, Daniel did the unthinkable. He didn't just step down, he vanished. He walked away from a multi-billion-dollar empire, sold his majority shares to anonymous trusts, deleted his public digital footprint, and became a ghost. All for one reason: Sophie. He traded boardroom battles for bedtime stories and global dominance for the soft, steady breath of a daughter who needed her father more than the world needed another tech titan. Today, Daniel is a freelance technical consultant. No titles, no vanity. He lives in a modest house with a garden, far from the flashing lights. He is a father who makes heart-shaped pancakes on Sundays and helps with third-grade math. To his neighbors, he's just Dan, the quiet widower who's good with computers. Elena Voss, however, is the opposite. She is the lightning to his silence. As the CEO of an international investment group, she is used to sharks. She is a woman who breathes fire in negotiations and drinks cold brew like it's holy water. She had met Daniel during a minor technical consultation for one of her subsidiaries. She had expected a technician. She found a philosopher king in disguise. She invited Daniel to her sister's wedding for 2 reasons. First, she was tired of the lonely billionaire narrative the press loved to spin. Second, Sophie had become like a niece to her, the only person who didn't want anything from Elena except a story before nap time. Elena saw the man behind the single dad label. She saw the brilliance that others were too blinded by gold to notice. A mind that could still solve global logistics in a heartbeat, but chose to focus on the color of a butterfly's wing. The moment they arrived at the Voss family estate, the atmosphere shifted. The guests were the elite of Europe, the 1% of the 1%, old money with dusty titles and new tech with shiny teeth. All of them looked at Daniel's modest, unbranded watch and his lack of an entourage. In a world where status is measured by the length of your shadow, Daniel appeared to have none. "Elena, darling," her mother, Regina, whispered as they approached the greeting line. Her voice was like silk stretched over a razor blade. The guest list was very specific. "We have senators here. We have dukes. We didn't realize you were bringing the child care." Elena's jaw tightened. "Daniel is my guest, mother, and Sophie is the most well-behaved person in this entire villa. Done." The insults were subtle at first, then increasingly sharp. During the pre-ceremony drinks on the terrace, Elena's cousins, men who had never worked a day in their lives but spoke as if they owned the sun, surrounded Daniel. "So Daniel, isn't it?" one began, swirling a cognac that cost more than a teacher's monthly salary. "Elena says you're in consulting. What's the portfolio look like? Are we talking Series A or just local businesses?" Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't feel the need to defend a life they couldn't possibly understand. "I focus on efficiency," he said simply, "solving problems that people don't realize they have yet." They exchanged smirks, mistaking his humility for mediocrity. They compared his simple, quiet life to the titans of industry, standing just feet away, unaware that many of those titans had built their companies on code Daniel had written in his 20s. The heat of the Italian sun was nothing compared to the coldness of the Voss family. They treated Daniel like a glitch in a perfect system. Yet Daniel remained the eye of the storm. He knelt down on the gravel path to fix a loose ribbon on Sophie's dress, his fingers deft and gentle. As they walked toward the reception, Regina caught Elena alone. "I expect him to stay in the background, Elena. Don't let that child ruin the photos. This is a day for high society, not a playground." Elena didn't argue. She simply looked at her mother with a cold pity that Regina couldn't quite decipher. Elena knew that if Daniel Hart decided to speak, he could buy the very ground Regina stood on 10 times over before dessert was served. But Daniel chose silence, and in that silence, he was more powerful than all of them combined. Sophie leaned in and whispered into his ear, her voice a small sanctuary. "Daddy, don't worry. They don't know how kind you are. They don't know you're a superhero who can fix anything." Daniel kissed her forehead, the scent of lavender and sunshine in her hair. "Being your dad is the only title I need, Sophie. The rest is just noise." The wedding was a theater of status, and the play was becoming a tragedy of manners. As the sun began to dip behind the Italian mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, the guests moved toward the reception hall. The whispers grew louder, feeding on the arrogance of the crowd like a wildfire. "Elena has finally lost her standards," one socialite remarked, her voice dripping with the entitlement of 3 generations of inheritance. "Bringing a man with no last name, no pedigree to the wedding of the season? It's a calculated insult to the family legacy. It's pathetic." Regina Voss made it her personal mission to ensure Daniel felt his place, or rather, his lack of one. She treated him like invisible furniture, a piece of decor that didn't fit the room. When the seating charts were revealed, Elena was horrified to find Daniel and Sophie placed at table 42, a small, wobbly table tucked away near the kitchen entrance, shielded from the main hall by a massive floral arrangement. Elena tried to protest, her eyes flashing with a billionaire's fury. "This is unacceptable, Mother. Move them to the head table immediately." But Daniel squeezed her hand, his touch a cooling balm. "It's okay, Elena, really. The view is better from the back anyway. Sophie and I can watch the kitchen staff. They're far more interesting than the guests. Don't let them ruin your sister's day." Elena relented, but the bitterness stayed in her throat. She spent the evening oscillating between her duty as a Voss and her heart as a woman who respected a man who didn't need a crown to be a king. Then there was the groom, Marco Bellini. At 34, Marco was the golden boy of the international hospitality industry. He was the face of 100 magazines, the man opening luxury hotels from Dubai to New York. He walked with a swagger that suggested he had invented the concept of the 5-star experience. He was confident, he was loud, and he was deeply, secretly indebted to a past he rarely spoke about. A past that involved a small, windowless office and a man who had seen potential in a bankrupt dreamer. Marco hadn't seen Daniel in 6 years. Back then, Daniel was the untouchable legend, the man whose yes could mint a billionaire and whose no could sink a shipping fleet. Marco had been nothing but a desperate kid with a dying hotel chain and a revolutionary but unpolished business plan. During the pre-wedding gala dinner, Marco took the stage. The spotlights caught the diamonds on his cuffs. He raised a toast to his new bride. But like all men of his stature, the speech soon drifted toward his own legend. "I am here because I worked harder than anyone," Marco declared, his voice booming through the hall. "I saw the gaps in the market. I took the risks. But," he paused, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, "I also had a mentor, a ghost of a man who taught me that business isn't about rooms or revenue. It's about the soul of service. He gave me my first $5 million when the banks were laughing in my face. He wrote the blueprint for the Bellini empire on a napkin in a diner. And then he disappeared. I've spent years and a lot of money trying to find him just to say thank you, to tell him I didn't waste his gift." The crowd erupted in applause. They loved the story of the mysterious mentor. It added a layer of myth to Marco's brand. Daniel sat at table 42, peeling an orange for Sophie with careful, rhythmic movements. He listened to the words, a faint, sad smile playing on his lips. He remembered that desperate kid. He remembered the smell of cheap coffee and the way Marco's hands had shaken as he presented his ideas. Daniel had seen the hunger in Marco's eyes, a hunger that he hoped hadn't turned into greed. Waiters hurried past their table, occasionally ignoring their request for water. "Sir, we have to prioritize the VIP tables," one young server said dismissively. Sophie looked up at Daniel, her eyes wide. "Are we not VIPs, Daddy?" Daniel smiled, unfazed. "VIP stands for very important person, Sophie. And to me, you're the most important person in the world. That makes this the best table in the house." His patience was an armor that no insult could pierce. The tension in the air was a physical thing, a tightening coil. Elena was vibrating with silent rage. She watched as Regina Voss walked past Daniel to greet a minor Italian count, literally brushing Daniel aside. "They have no idea, Daniel," Elena hissed, her voice trembling. "They are mocking a lion while they worship a house cat. I should stand up. I should tell them that the man they are searching for is sitting right here, eating a cold appetizer at a kitchen table." "No," Daniel replied, his voice a low, steady hum. "Let them have their illusions, Elena. Truth isn't a weapon to be used for spite. I'm not here to be a CEO. I'm here to be your friend, and to show Sophie that a man's worth isn't determined by the chair he sits in, but by the person he is when the lights are off." The bells of the ancient chapel rang out, their iron voices echoing across the lake. The ceremony began. The chapel was a masterpiece of Renaissance marble and gilded altars. Marco stood at the front, looking every bit the conqueror of worlds. The music swelled, a live orchestra playing a hauntingly beautiful arrangement. The bride walked down the aisle in a dress that cost more than a suburban home. It was perfect. It was expensive. It was a carefully curated lie. As the couple stood before the priest, the air was heavy with the scent of incense and old stone. The speak now moment arrived. In these circles, it was a formality, a traditional pause that no one expected to be filled. The priest asked for the blessing of the families. Marco turned his head to acknowledge the Voss family in the front row, his face a mask of practiced gratitude. His eyes swept across the pews, moving from the front to the back, a habit of a man who always checked his exits. And then his gaze locked onto the man sitting in the very last row, next to the heavy oak doors. The color drained from Marco's face so fast it looked like a physical blow. His hands, usually so steady, began to shake. The golden boy suddenly looked like a frightened child. He didn't see a single dad. He didn't see staff or childcare. He saw the architect. He saw the ghost of greatness. He saw the only man he had ever truly feared and respected. Marco stepped away from his bride, ignoring her confused tug on his sleeve. The music stumbled and stopped. The air in the chapel seemed to vanish, leaving a vacuum of silence so intense it made people's ears ring. "Marco," the bride whispered, her voice cracking. "What is it? What are you doing?" Marco didn't answer her. He didn't even hear her. He walked down the center aisle, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking like gunshots against the marble floor. Every head turned. The Voss family watched in sheer horror as the groom walked past the millionaires, past the dignitaries, past the front row power brokers, and stopped right in front of the man at the very back. "Boss?" Marco's voice was barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the chapel, it sounded like a thunderclap. Daniel stood up slowly, his movements fluid and dignified. He didn't look like a man who had been hiding. He looked like a man who had simply been waiting. He looked at Marco with the same calm, penetrating intensity he had used years ago to dissect a business plan. "Boss, I didn't know," Marco stammered, his eyes filling with tears that shocked everyone who knew him as a ruthless negotiator. "I've looked everywhere. I hired investigators. I searched every database. I didn't know it was you here today." The chapel was frozen. Regina Voss looked like she was having a stroke. The guests were paralyzed, their mouths literally hanging open. "Marco," Daniel said, his voice steady, warm, and utterly commanding. "It's your wedding day. You have a beautiful bride waiting. You should be at the altar." "I wouldn't have an altar to stand at if it wasn't for you," Marco replied, his voice gaining strength as his shock turned into a desperate need for recognition. He turned to the stunned crowd, gesturing wildly at Daniel. You all see a guest. You see a man you thought didn't belong. But I see the man who built my life. This man is Daniel Hart. He was the founder of Hart Global. He was the Oracle. He was my investor, my teacher, my mentor, my brother. Twist one hit like a sledgehammer. The single dad wasn't just wealthy. He was the source of the Groom's entire existence. He was the legend they had all been whispering about just hours before. Twist 2 hit even harder, a silent realization that rippled through the Voss family. By insulting Daniel, by seating him at a wobbly table near the trash, they had been insulting the very person who held the strings to their new son-in-law's empire. They had humiliated the king while trying to impress the prince. Daniel stepped into the aisle. He didn't boast. He didn't look at the Voss family with the contempt they deserved. He simply put a hand on Marco's shoulder, a gesture of profound grace. Today isn't about business, Marco. It isn't about Hart Global or the Bellini Empire. It's about love. It's about the promise you're about to make. Go marry your wife. Be the man I taught you to be. Marco did something no one in that room would ever forget. He didn't just walk back. He bowed. Not a nod, but a deep, traditional, respectful bow to a man who had chosen a daughter over a kingdom. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It was heavy, thick with the weight of realized shame and the sudden, blinding light of the truth. The reception was no longer a party of snobs. It was an assembly of the humbled. The golden hall felt different now, the opulence looking gaudy in the face of Daniel's quiet dignity. Marco Bellini didn't return to the head table alone. He refused to let the ceremony continue until the seating was rectified. He personally walked to table 42, picked up Sophie's small hand, and led them to the front of the room. He insisted that Daniel, Sophie, and Elena move to the seat of honor, right next to the bride and groom. The Voss family sat in a state of suspended animation. Regina Voss couldn't meet Daniel's eyes. She realized that every sneer she had directed at him was now a stain on her own reputation. As the servants scrambled to set new place settings, the air grew thick with a different kind of tension. The sound of elite guests frantically deleting social media posts that had mocked Daniel earlier. Men who had smirked at his unbranded watch now leaned in, trying to catch a fragment of his conversation as if it were a prophecy. The childcare they had scoffed at was now the center of the universe. Before the first course was served, Marco took the microphone. His hands were steady now, but his eyes were fixed on Daniel. "I have an apology to make," Marco said, his voice echoing through the ballroom. "Not just to Daniel, but to the very idea of success. I spent this morning bragging about what I built, pretending I was a self-made man. But I forgot the most important lesson Daniel ever taught me, that the tallest trees have the deepest, most silent roots. I allowed my guests and my new family to treat a giant like a commoner because he had the courage to be humble. Daniel, I am sorry. Sophie, I am sorry. You are the guests of honor, not just today, but in my life." The guests who had whispered insults earlier were now suffocating on their own words. They looked at Daniel, really looked at him this time. They saw the quality of his suit, not as a lack of brand, but as a masterpiece of bespoke tailoring. They saw the intelligence in his eyes, not as technical consulting, but as the wisdom of a man who had seen the top of the mountain and decided the valley was more beautiful. Elena stood by Daniel's side, her hand firmly in his. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence was her victory. She had been the only one with the vision to see the man beneath the labels. The change in the room was electric. Regina tried to approach Daniel with a forced smile, her voice trembling. "Daniel, we had no idea. The seating chart was a terrible clerical error. We hope you can forgive the oversight." Daniel looked at her, not with anger, but with a terrifyingly clear neutrality. "It's fine, Regina. Sometimes people see what they want to see. I just hope you see Sophie for who she is now." Regina withered under his gaze, realizing that no amount of money could buy back the respect she had so carelessly thrown away. The bride, Elena's sister, was the first to break the tension. She walked over to Sophie, knelt down on the silk-covered floor, and handed the little girl her own bridal bouquet. "Your dad is incredible, Sophie. He is the most important man in this room, And you are the most important girl. Sophie beamed, clutching the flowers. I told them he was a superhero. Superheroes don't need to wear capes. They just need to be there when you're scared. The atmosphere had shifted from judgment to reverence. Throughout the night, the power dynamics of the room inverted. The guests who had once formed a barrier around the VIP section now formed a respectful circle around Daniel, keeping their distance as if he were a holy relic. The same cousins who had mocked his portfolio now stood awkward and silent, realizing their entire inheritance wouldn't buy 5 minutes of Daniel's true attention. Daniel handled it all with the same calm he had shown at table 42. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't make them crawl. He simply spoke to them as humans, reminding them through his presence that status is a shadow, but character is the sun. If you believe respect matters more than status, if you believe that the heart of a father is worth more than the bank account of a billionaire, type, I will live kindly. The moon rose over Lake Como, casting a silver shimmering path across the water. The wedding was over, the echoes of the music fading into the rustle of the olive trees. In the weeks that followed, the global business world was in an absolute uproar. Rumors of Daniel Hart's return spread like wildfire through London, New York, and Tokyo. The stock of every company he had ever touched saw a speculative jump. The press clamored for an interview, a photo, a statement. But Daniel Hart didn't return. He didn't accept the board seats offered by the Voss family in a desperate attempt at damage control. He didn't take the multi-million-dollar signing bonuses from tech giants. He stayed in his quiet house with the garden. He kept helping Sophie with her math. He kept making those heart-shaped pancakes. Marco Bellini, however, was a changed man. He continued to run his hotels, but the swagger was gone, replaced by a deep, thoughtful responsibility. He started a global foundation for single parents, providing the initial investment for families in crisis. He led with the kindness Daniel had modeled for him. He checked his ego at the door every single morning, remembering the man who had bowed to a higher calling. Elena and Daniel's relationship grew, not in the spotlight of the paparazzi, but in the quiet, sacred moments of shared coffee, long walks in the park, and the shared joy of watching Sophie grow. It was a slow, steady flame, the kind that doesn't burn out because it's fueled by truth. As the years passed, the Voss family tried to use Daniel's name to boost their social standing, but Daniel never played along. He remained a mystery to the public, known only as the man who walked away from everything to gain what actually mattered. He proved that the most powerful thing you can do in a world obsessed with noise is to be perfectly, intentionally still. In the final scene, Sophie is running across the lush grass of the Voss estate during a quiet family weekend. Elena stands with Daniel, her head resting on his shoulder as they watch the sunset. Do you ever regret it? Elena asks softly, her voice a gentle inquiry. Walking away from the empire? Leaving the boss title behind? You could have had it all again after that wedding. Daniel watches Sophie laugh as she chases a butterfly, her hair flying in the wind. He feels the warmth of Elena's hand in his and the solid ground beneath his feet. He thinks about the billions he gave away and the one precious life he saved, and the new life he was building with the woman beside him. He smiles. It's the smile of a man who has finally solved the greatest equation of all. I didn't walk away from anything, Elena, he says, his voice a whisper of pure contentment. I walked toward the only thing that was ever real. Eshfanan, the voiceover fades in, a final reflection for the digital age. They mocked a guest. They met a mentor, and a child watched her father be honored, not for what he owned, but for who he chose to be. True power doesn't need a loud voice or a front row seat. It only needs a quiet heart and the courage to choose love over a kingdom. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to NL Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.